talking about this morning.
Okay, welcome back. So Jacob is heading to Paddan Aram, up there.
Oh, I'm so
It's
sorry.
all right. Up there. And the verse we're about to look at says that he went east, which is interesting because northeast maybe, but this whole area is the east in Bible mindset. All right, Jacob in Paddan Aram, the fields of Aram. Jacob was 74 years old and the year was 1764. If you're wondering why I'm keeping track of it, it will matter once we get to the Exodus. Okay, it will actually matter what the year is. Laban's probably about 120 years old, and until I put all these ages together, I didn't realise how old Laban was. Now, if Laban's 120 years old when Jacob turns up, this would mean he was about 26 years old when Rebekah left Haran, which would kind of fit the account that we see in Genesis where he runs to meet the servant. He seems like an eager young man, and he and Bethuel confer quite a bit. So let's read a bit of this. Genesis 29, verse 1. Then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. So it's actually the people of the east. The entire area of Mesopotamia is the east. It's all right, Rachel. And he looked, and behold, a well in the field. Now, interesting. They keep finding these wives by the well. And lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it, for out of that well they watered the flocks, and a great stone was upon the well's mouth. And thither were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the sheep, and put the stone again upon the well's mouth in his place. Kept the well clean, made sure no one fell in it. And Jacob said unto them, My brethren, whence be ye? And they said, Of Haran are we. And he said unto them, Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel his daughter cometh with the sheep. And I'll go down to verse 10. And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. So he met Rachel, encountered Laban's daughter Rachel at the same place that Abraham's servant had found Rebekah, at the well outside Haran. Now, there was initial euphoria, long-lost relatives and all that, but the ongoing arrangements soon had to be sorted out. Jacob was going to live with Laban for a while. They had to decide how things were going to work. And Jacob had quickly fallen in love with Rachel, and so he figured that 7 years would be long enough. He's always thinking, isn't he? He's always figuring something, scheming something. And he's probably thinking, well, 7 years, that'll let Esau settle down. For me, it'd be a bit like a vacation. What do they go on? A gap year. A gap 7 years. You know, a bit of an adventure before I settle down and do the patriarch thing in Canaan. And 7 years, that's about the right amount of time to serve in exchange for the woman of his dreams. And as is always the case, if it's a bit too neat, it was all very neat, it's a bit too neat. The schemer was still scheming, but he was about to receive a very rude shock. Verse 16, and Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. Elder. What had Jacob just done? He'd just stolen the birthright and the blessing of the elder. And the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favoured. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban agrees to that. So Leah has some sort of eye problem, which meant she was difficult to marry off. Verse 21, Jacob said unto Laban, so he served for 7 years. I should read verse 20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. And Jacob said unto Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. These are the guys that come after him 13 years later. So, Jacob, they're not your friends. It came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to him, and he went in unto her. So, Jacob was tricked. Laban was an even better schemer than Jacob, and his eldest daughter Leah was a liability in the marriage game due to those eyesight problems. So Laban switched the prize, and Jacob married Leah without realising what was going on. The Lord's hand was obviously in this situation. The supplanter, Jacob, was suddenly confronted with the rights of the firstborn. What does Laban say? It must not be so done. In our country, you might get away with this in Canaan, Jacob, but not here. To give the younger before the firstborn, that's Genesis 29 verse 26. Yet beyond Laban's superior scheming, the Lord was working out the foundations of the nation of Israel. Jacob had no idea what was going on. He would have looked back decades down the track and realised, but at the time, all he knows is things have gone horribly wrong. In the time of Ruth, the elders in the gate of Bethlehem had the correct emphasis, analysis, interpretation. They told Ruth the Moabitess that Leah and Rachel had built the house of Israel. That's in Ruth chapter 4, verse 11. So God is building the family that's going to build the nation. However, while the first 7 years which Jacob served for Rachel may have seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her, Genesis 29:20, the next 7 years must have seemed like a slow-motion nightmare. For one thing, he had 2 wives and ended up with 4. Furthermore, the 2 sisters were locked in a vicious competition for his affection. This is why God gives every man 1 wife. And in the Old Testament, there was allowance for a man to marry more than 1 wife. I think mainly for the welfare of a woman who otherwise would be on her own in that society. But it never works out well. We never see a situation in the Bible where a man's got 2 wives and it's domestic bliss. While Rachel was naturally the favourite, the Lord evened the balance. Now, back to a theme we've been on. Rachel was the 3rd barren woman of the Bible. Genesis chapter 30 we'll read 1 and 2. So the context is that Leah has had 4 sons. We'll go through those in a minute. God evened things up. He saw that Leah was not the favourite. Leah was rejected in a way, or at least neglected. And so he gave her 4 sons. And here's Rachel's reaction. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children or else I die. Now she's like Rebecca. Careful what you say. You might be prophesying something that occurs. Rebecca prophesied a curse on herself. Rachel prophesied something about dying for children. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? Rachel is that 3rd barren woman of the Bible, and while Leah had Reuben, now the names It's a contest. It's a fight. What's Leah saying with Reuben? Well, Reuben means behold a son. Look here, Rachel, I've got a son. Then she had Simeon. Simeon means he who hears. Look here, Rachel, God's hearing me, not you. We're both praying for sons. How many have you got? It's 2 now. Levi means joined. And the idea is that, come on, Jacob, I've got 3 sons now. You've got to be joined to me, not Rachel. And Judah means praise. What does she say in verse 35 of chapter 29? Now will I praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. So the feud between Leah and Rachel spilled over into concubine territory. Dangerous territory, that. And Jacob ended up with 2 more wives and 4 more sons. So Rachel's maid Bilhah, she has Dan, which means judging, and Rachel's saying, hey, God's judging between you and me, and look, I've got a son now. And Naphtali, what does Rachel say about this? Naphtali means wrestling. With great wrestlings, this is verse 8 of chapter 30, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. So Leah then gives Zilpah, her maid, to Jacob as a concubine, and she has 2 sons. The first one, Gad. Leah's saying, Gad means a troop, or as in an army. Leah's saying, there's an army of sons coming, Rachel, you can't beat me. And then Zilpah has another son, and she calls him Asher, and Asher means happy, as in, yeah, I've got 6 sons, 2 of them through Zilpah. You've got 2, I'm the happy one. So both Leah and Rachel were desperately praying to be pregnant with even more sons, and God did listen to Leah first. Even after all these other sons, she keeps going. She bore Issachar, which means higher. And there's that little story about Reuben. Reuben comes out of the field with mandrakes, and Rachel wants some. And then so Leah hires Jacob for the mandrakes, and she gets pregnant with Issachar. So Issachar means higher. And Zebulun means God will honour. So this is still that feud. They're still making commentary through the feud. And then finally she has a daughter, Dinah, that means judgment. As in God has made a judgment here. You still don't actually have any children of your own, and look at all my children. Finally, the Lord heard the cry of Rachel. So Genesis chapter 30, verse 22. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. Joseph means adding. Of course, he was the best of the 12 in character. In naming Joseph, Rachel was prophesying that God would add one more son to her, not realizing that the birth of this son would also take her own life. So, we can empathise with Jacob, even if he probably brought it on himself. He's running a household with 4 wives, 11 sons and a daughter. He's working long hours, often at night, no penalty rates, in a harsh environment. There it is. And he's not getting much sleep either. See that in Genesis 31 verse 40, where after he takes off and Laban tracks him down, he's telling Laban off, and he says, thus I was in the day, the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from mine eyes. Well, Jacob had agreed to stay with Uncle Laban for another 6 years in exchange for the reject sheep and goats, but the whole situation was turning sour. So, can happen, can't it? Outstay your welcome. 20 years is a long time to have your nephew turn up and stay with you. back to Canaan. So by now Jacob is 94 years old, and we mustn't think of him as being a modern 94-year-old. Maybe in his 50s, late 40s maybe. The year is 1744 BC. Laban had mistreated and cheated Jacob, but the Lord had tilted the scales back to even up accounts. Now Jacob tries out this manipulative animal husbandry. We see that in Genesis chapter 30 verses 25 to 43. And whether it's Jacob's brilliance or the Lord just made it happen anyway, Jacob had the greater flocks, and Laban's sons are becoming envious and resentful. What does it say in chapter 31 verse 1? And he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. Verse 2, and Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field under his flock. So he has a conference with his wives, the senior wives. The Lord's intervening directly and sending Jacob back to Canaan. He holds this meeting out in the fields with Leah and Rachel, explaining that God had appeared unto him, and then they also complain about their treatment which they received at the hands of their fathers. What do they say? He sold us and he's devoured the dowry. See that in Genesis chapter 31 verses 17 to 21. So can we just go back to the map for a second? Jacob sets a course for Mount Gilead. So he's here in Haran. Mount Gilead's about here. Is that right? About there. So the highway goes there. So he's got a 3-day head start. And Laban catches him here. A slow motion race. So the conspiracy to get out of town without Laban knowing means they leave when Laban was out of town for sheep shearing. So he'd gone off to, they knew the patterns of this sort of lifestyle. It's always, there's a time to do things, and it was time to shear sheep, so Laban was off doing that, and they took off. Rachel takes Laban's idols, Genesis chapter 31 verses 17 to 21, his household gods. Jacob sets a course for Mount Gilead, and off they went, and Laban finds out 3 days later, so they've got a 3-day head start, and he takes, I reckon it's the same guys that were at the wedding. Forms a posse to retrieve the runaways. His status and pride has been dented by Jacob's actions, but despite the way that Jacob left, this was God's will. It was God's will that he goes back, and God intervenes. So we see him appearing to Laban in a dream the night before he overtook Jacob. Genesis chapter 31 verse 24, and God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Now did he obey that? I feel like he did say some bad things, but he was trying not to, so God honoured that. The result was a tense and frustrated standoff on Mount Gilead with empty accusations from both men. So they both vented their spleen. And then what do you do at the end of it? As Laban said, what am I going to do? Kill my daughters and my grandchildren? In the end, Laban farewelled and blessed his daughters and their children, searched in vain for his idols, and then he swore a very strange covenant with Jacob. I've heard people, this is a Mizpah blessing, they say. If this is a blessing, please don't bless me, because this is aggressive. They couldn't even agree on what they called it. So, as I said, every time Jacob does something significant, he sets up a pillar. verse 45 of Genesis 31. And Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, so these other guys that were with Laban, gather stones. And they took stones and made an heap and did eat there upon the heap. And Laban called it Jigar-Sahar-Duthar, but Jacob called it Gilead. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it Gilead. And Mizpah, for he said, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. Now some people think that's a nice thing to say. What it means is, I can't be here to watch what you're going to do, so may God watch you and deal with you if you don't do the right thing. And he's talking about his daughters. He says, you treat my daughters right, and I can't be there to make sure that you do that. So we swear this oath, this Mizpah oath. This is really interesting in another way though.
So many churches use that as a farewell.
They don't read it, do they? They just don't read it. Why would you invoke that? I'm sure there's...
Churches and church meetings all include.
Yeah. In other words, I don't trust you, so may God watch you and deal with you if you do the wrong thing between now and the next time we meet. Yeah, strange one. Both men swore not to cross the Mizpah line on Mount Gilead, that heap of rocks, Jacob's pillar. Mizpah means God is watching. Like superstitious old lady, isn't it? And the idea was that Laban was telling Jacob to treat his daughters well, as God would be watching. This is very significant. The division in the family of Terah finally became permanent. Nahor's descendants would remain in Paddan Aram, and Abraham's descendants would remain in Canaan. There was no more crossing over to each other. Well, we can say out of the frying pan into the fire, because now Jacob has to confront Esau.
Sorry, what was that? What was that first thing? We didn't get that. The last one. The first filling. Was that Jacob had the greater
Flocks, yes, that's correct.
It wasn't one word I was thinking of for that.
Yeah, so he kept taking the speckled and the spotted and otherwise not very attractive looking animals and ended up with the greater flocks. Confronting Esau, Jacob had just seen off Laban and his company, but then he had to think about, hang on, why did I go to Paddan Aram in the first place? To get away from Esau. Esau had wanted to kill him for stealing the blessing. You kind of forget that when you've got 4 wives and 12 kids and in-law troubles. Yet the Lord was with Jacob. And we see that at the start of chapter 32, that God sends a company of angels to meet him. And Mahanaim means 2 companies, 2 camps, and Jacob's company and the Lord's company. Unknown to Jacob, God had also softened Esau's heart towards his brother. Esau had done fantastically well. He was the ruler of Mount Seir. He didn't need to kill Jacob now. He didn't need to be in Canaan. He didn't want to be in Canaan. And Jacob was his only sibling, so he was keen to get back and welcome him and be around him. But before Jacob would know that he was forgiven, the Lord would wrestle with Jacob and finally subdue him. Something very significant coming up here. Having let Esau know that he'd returned, Jacob was startled to hear that Esau was on the way with 400 armed men. In those days, that's a small army. Now, that's probably the way Esau just travelled. You know, he's a big shot. Him and his gang of warriors on camels. But quite alarming for Jacob. Jacob instinctively went straight into scheming mode. He divided his company into 2 groups with the idea that one would be sacrificed if Esau attacked. We see that in Genesis 32 verses 7 and 8. And then he strings it out, doesn't he? He has it all his family, all the servants, all the flocks strung out in this big line. He's right at the end of it. And he's kind of trying to wear Esau out, wear him down before he meets him. Sets up a series of bands with the purpose of slowing Esau down and hopefully pacifying him before the brothers met. Jacob also sent a gift of animals, which would have been worth quite a bit, out in front of the entire company in a further attempt to placate his brother. Now, the desperation of the situation really showing on Jacob. How do we know this? He even resorts to prayer. He addressed the Lord from within the covenantal structure. Where's this? Verse 9, and Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which saidst unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I have passed over this Jordan, and now I am become two bands. So Jacob is addressing God as the God of Abraham and Isaac, part of that covenantal structure, and then he acknowledges that he's not worthy of any of God's mercies and the blessings that he's been given. And he honestly laid his fears before the Lord, which is the way to do it. He reminded God of his promises. We see that in verses 9 to 12. We're reading a bit of that. And Jacob also acknowledged the Lord's hand of blessing. I just read that. With my staff I passed over this Jordan. Now I'm become two bands. Now where are we? Where are we? Can we have that map for a sec, please? Thanks, Rachel. So on this map, we're about here. On this map, we can actually see the river. That's the Jabbok. Is that right? Yes, there's the Arnon. And there's the Zered. So the Jabbok River. These cliffs either side are quite steep. So he's up on Mount Gilead, comes down to the crossing, and then across into about there, I think. There's Shechem. So the location was one of the tributaries to the Jordan River, the Jabbok River, now called the Zarqwa River. It's on the east bank of the Jordan, but not far away from the main river. Not content with one prayer, so he's already prayed once. Jacob got up during the night, took his family over the Jabbok, and then retreated for private prayer on the far bank of the Jabbok. God dealt with Jacob once and for all that night. In a theophany, perhaps a Christophany, let's go to that next slide, please, Rachel. Yeah, there it is, bottom left. Looks like an angel, I don't know exactly how it was. But we do know that God, in the form of a man, wrestled with Jacob. And fortified by prayer, Jacob prevailed. Or at least he didn't lose. Let's see verse 24. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. It sounds extremely painful. So the Lord dislocated Jacob's thigh, completely changing the nature of the man. No longer could he scheme and run. It's hard to run with a dislocated hip, thigh. Now he just limped and waited on the Lord. This profound transformation was the making of Jacob. Isn't that ironic? The disabling of him was the making of him. And it gained him a new name. No longer was he Jacob the supplanter, now he was Israel, a prince with God. We see that in verse 28. Actually, let's read through to there. Verse 26, and he said, let me go, for the day breaketh. That's the Lord talking to Jacob. So it seems like the Lord reaches out and dislocates his hip, and Jacob just grabs on and won't let go. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. So what's actually happened there? God has said, who are you? And Jacob said, the supplanter. And he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel." You're not the supplanter anymore, you're the prince with God. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. So Jacob now had power with both God and men. Yet this name change did not occur until Jacob admitted to what he really was. So he confessed his main fault, the supplanter. Jacob named the place Peniel, as he had seen God face to face. We see that in Genesis 33 verse... Should that be 32? Yes, that should be chapter 32 verse 30. Chapter 33 doesn't have 30 verses. Having wrestled with God the night before, Jacob was able to meet Esau the next day, halting upon his thigh while Esau ran to meet him. All was forgiven, but Jacob still didn't want to go with Esau. He wasn't quite sure. So with a bit of subterfuge, he slipped away in his typical fashion, heading west, first to Succoth, which means booths, and then to Shalem, a city of Shechem where he bought some land. Now, what mistake has he made? Can we just have that map again, please, Rachel? So here's Canaanites of the plain, and this is the hill country of the Amorites. And he's come out here. He's just in here. He's just a little bit too close to the Canaanites. He's not amongst the Amorites or the Hittites. Abraham had observed the Canaanites of the plains and decided... Hang on, I've skipped a bit. We'll get to that in a sec. As the patriarch on duty at this point in time, Jacob built an altar and established a place of worship. He called it El Elohe Israel, the mighty one, the God of Israel. His choice of where he went caused trouble. So now we just look at some trouble to end off tonight. Jacob would spend the next 36 years in Canaan, but he'd see a lot of trouble in that time, and initially he moved into the same area in which Abraham had stayed when he first came into Canaan. Abraham had observed the Canaanites of the plains, and he moved on quickly. He wasn't hanging around amongst those guys. Abraham and Isaac preferred Hittites and Amorites as neighbours rather than the other Sevenites. Can you name them? Do we? Perizzites, Girgashites, Jebusites, Hivites. There's a few more. There you go, a bit of homework. Book of Joshua. Jacob had bought land amongst the Hivites, and he was soon to suffer the outrage of having his daughter raped by Shechem, the local prince who was named after the dynasty. Now, Dinah had been a bit naive. She'd gone out to meet some of the local girls, make some friends, and Shechem had noticed her and defiled her. We see that in Genesis chapter 34, verses 1 to 2. Shechem's father, King Hamor, quickly figured out this is not a good thing. This is a bad thing, volatile situation. So he tries to get ahead of the game and goes out to see Jacob and sort this matter out. Shechem wants to marry Dinah, Jacob's daughter, but Jacob's sons are not going to allow that, and they just want revenge. So it's quite callous and cynical what they did. They took the token of circumcision and they used it to disable the Hivites. They promised to intermarry with them if the Hivites got circumcised, and then Simeon and Levi took their swords when the Hivites were disabled for a couple of days, and they stormed the city. In cold fury, they slaughtered the male inhabitants, enslaved the females and the children, and then the rest of Jacob's sons came and sacked the town of Shoalhaven. That's in Genesis 34, verses 25 to 31. And I think the small nature of these proto-nations is evident in that two men, Simeon and Levi, were able to kill every man in town. The moral and spiritual nature of this incident is a bit mixed. Really, only Shechem deserved to die, for he was the only one that committed the crime. And Simeon and Levi did have a good point. In verse 31 of Genesis 34, they said, "Should he deal with our sister as with an harlot, but many others were also slaughtered. Still, we should remember that the Lord did use this incident to strike fear into the Canaanites concerning Israel and his company as they journeyed. No one else attacked them. Oh, I missed out Genesis there. Genesis 35 verse 5. However, on the other hand, there's long-term ramifications. Jacob's still talking about this on his deathbed. He makes some prophecies in Genesis chapter 49 verses 1 to 27. And speaking of Simeon and Levi, he cursed their anger, not becoming of God's people to be cruel the way they were. And he did describe how they toppled the city wall of Shoalhaven. See that in verse 6 of Genesis 49. Excuse me. Jacob also condemned those two tribes to being scattered amongst the other tribes of Israel. Might just read that verse. Have you ever thought about that? Levi never had it. The tribe of Levi never had its own territory at all. They just had those 6 cities amongst the other tribes. And Simeon was subsumed into Judah. So Genesis 49 verse 7. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So neither of those two tribes got a separate inheritance in Canaan. Well, last subheading, heartbreak for Jacob. This is tough times, really. In great turmoil of heart, Jacob returned to Bethel, the house of God, and built an altar. He was a changed man since being crippled by the Lord at Penuel. Before then, Jacob had always taken the initiative, creating the circumstances and forcing others to follow or react. So he liked to do things, and then others had to deal with what he'd done. But from now on, from Penuel on, he was the one who was seeing what others did, and he let God direct him. The new Jacob was reacting to circumstances in the spirit, which would have been an uncomfortable place for the supplanter, but this is the right way to approach life for the prince with God. The Lord appeared to him and confirmed his change of name and nature, as well as confirming his place within the Abrahamic covenant. And Jacob set up another pillar at Bethel, he'd already done that once, and anointed it. Genesis chapter 35 verses 9 to 15. Now the tragedies begin to strike. Rachel's nurse, Deborah, had died at Bethel and been buried under Allon Bacuth. Allon is oak, and Bacuth is weeping, the oak of weeping. That's in Genesis chapter 35 verse 8. It says, but Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, Rebekah's nurse, not Rachel's nurse, died, and she was buried beneath Bethel under an oak, and the name of it was called Allon Bacuth. Worse was to come. Whether or not Jacob should have been travelling with Rachel heavily pregnant is not clear, but certainly the death of, I've got here Rachel's nurse, should be Rebekah's nurse, at Bethel would not have helped. Whatever the particulars, Rachel went into labour as they neared Bethlehem, and tragically she died soon after her second son was born. That's in Genesis 35 verses 16 to 20. She named him Benoni, son of my sorrow. But Jacob renamed him Benjamin, son of my right hand. While Jacob would live for at least another 70 years, and eventually he would be buried with Leah in the family burial ground at Machpelah near Hebron, he buried his heart that day with Rachel at Bethlehem. He called her his right hand. What did he say? Son of my right hand, son of this wife Rachel, and set up a pillar upon her grave. Think about it this way, they'd probably only been married for about 15 years. The death of Rachel has an interesting tie-in with the slaughter of the infants of Bethlehem by Herod. And the prophet Jeremiah spoke of Rachel weeping for her children and not being comforted. That's in Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 15 and Matthew chapter 2 verses 16 to 18. In Genesis, the mention of Ephrath or Ephratah, the region around Bethlehem, reminds us of that town's close connection with Caleb. See that in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 24. Ephrath was Caleb's second wife. See that in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 19. After the death of Rachel, further strife would follow as Reuben, his firstborn, took advantage of the fact that I guess people were distracted and there was a bit of a power vacuum in the family since Rachel was not there to stand up for her side of things, and he cynically fornicated with Bilhah, Rachel's maid, who was Jacob's concubine. That's Genesis chapter 35 verse 22. This had long-term ramifications for Reuben. He forfeited his role of family leadership. He was the eldest son. On his deathbed, doing the prophecies of his sons, Jacob prophesied that Reuben would not excel. Genesis 49 verses 3 and 4. It's interesting, over the next 1200 years, leadership of the nation of Israel would mainly be shared between the descendants of Levi, who had the spiritual leadership, the descendants of Joseph. Joshua came from Joseph, and also a number of the judges were descendants of Joseph, and the descendants of Judah, which was royal leadership. Reuben's descendants just didn't figure at all. Well, back to Bethlehem. Heading further south at some point, Jacob finally reached Hebron, where his father Isaac lived in retirement. It's in Genesis chapter 36, verses 27 to 29. Now, the time frame here is a bit vague. Isaac lived to be 180 years old, so he probably lived another 20 years after Jacob came back to Canaan. So it may be one of those situations where the Bible keeps telling the story past the point and then comes back to a previous point. Because if you do all the numbers, when Isaac dies, Joseph has been in Israel for 4 to 5 years. Well, from Jacob's point of view, Rebekah had long since died, and when Isaac finally died in 1718 BC, his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. That's in Genesis 35 verse 29. So we've been up into Paddan Aram, and we've come back to Canaan, and we've laid the foundations for a nation and seen some family tragedies all in one evening. Any comments or questions before we close?
Before the heartbreak for Jacob, when we talked about Jacob referred to the slaughter at Shoalhaven, and we got that prophecies concerning the future, and
Okay, so where are we?
right before the heartbreak for Jacob.
Last days. Yes, Genesis 49. I've never heard a message preached on it. Maybe it's not something that should be preached on, but
What, that they wanted revenge and they slaughtered the male in Jacob? And then what, sorry?
Here's an interesting thing.
Slaughtered the male? Yeah.
How in the world did Isaac not know it wasn't Esau?
I've never been able to figure that out. Maybe,
But the next generation, how in the world did Jacob not know it wasn't Rachel? He had the same trick played on him, the same, I can't think of the right adjective, dumbfounding trick played on him that he played on his dad.
maybe the Lord intervened both times and just didn't allow them to recognize the obvious.
Yeah, because it almost seems, I've always concluded God had to do something, or it was something extravagant.
she didn't actually talk to him, but it was dark, so maybe you could sort of put it that way. It was dark, he didn't actually see, but the first time it was like, hang on, they're actually talking to each other. Wouldn't you recognise
Maybe it's like
your son's voice?
Balaam and the angel. It wasn't until God allowed him to see reality that he could see it.
But whatever happened to Isaac to allow him to not recognize his son, whatever extreme thing kept, that's what God also allowed to happen to Jacob on his wedding night to Rachel.
Fair's fair.
I wonder if he thought about it. You know, face palm later on the next day or whenever, and he said, how could I do that? What happened? Then he probably remembered, oh, I did this to Dad. So,
Fair point.
interesting.
Fair point, yes.
Well, what made
You reap
say
what you sow.
Rachel has eye problems?
Leah.
Leah has eye problems.
Tender-eyed.
Yes,
Yeah.
the tender-eyed also just means that she was still fair to look at. She just wasn't as beautiful as Rachel. That's how I've always looked at it. She's still nice, but Rachel was beautiful and everything else, whereas she just didn't measure up. I didn't see that she had eye problems.
Because she can't see, she wasn't a
Yeah, it says in Genesis 29 verse 17, Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favoured. So there's something about, it's the literal Hebrew in the note I've got says weak-eyed. So yeah, she had, it seems she had some sort of eye problem and just generally wasn't as beautiful and well-favoured as her sister. Which, as much as fellas don't admit it, is often the criteria they use for picking a bride. So, but he had to marry. He had to marry Leah. Otherwise, he misses out on 8 sons. It'll take a long time.
She can't be that bad if you go backwards.
It'll take a long time to build the nation of Israel of 2 sons. Yeah. Anyway, any other questions or comments?
What was the very last on page 10? Joseph had been in blank for 4 to 5 years by this point.
Israel.
Egypt.
Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
Egypt. Yeah, by the time Isaac dies, Joseph's already in Egypt. Mm. All right, let's close and we'll head off. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for these accounts and the things that we learn and the personal lessons of sowing and reaping and the attitudes that people take and the way it ends up. Lord, we also thank you for this explanation of how Israel came into existence and the way that the 12 tribes eventually came about. Thank you that we can meet together and study your word. Pray you bless us in Jesus' name. Amen.